welcome to the
I watched the Russian.
in my opinion, one of the Hello and welcome to the newest edition of the Brussels Signal Horizon podcast. My guests today, Brent Johnson and Mike Lavery, don't need an introduction because most of you already know them. We had Michael on the podcast 2 times already. Brent, for you, it is the second time. And if people ask, Ralph, why are you having on the same people again? It's for a very simple reason. I'd rather have people who most of the time hit the nail on the head on 10 times than some clickbait producers or outrage paddlers whom you cannot trust. Now, I always say to Michael and to Brent, both of them always get the same compliment from me, but that doesn't mean that it's not sincere. There are 4 or 5 people whom I trust. Brent and Mike are among them. I think if you check out either the Substack, in Brent's case, if you check out Michael's work at Rabobank and follow his Twitter, his X account, you'll see that they really have the finger on the pulse of what's going on. And they do something that I personally like a lot is they are serious without being silly, and they're entertaining without being, let's say, just on the hunt for getting followers. So it's always informative. I have an own secret hidden Twitter account on which I only follow 12 people. Now, the 2 of them are obviously among them, and that's where I get the most information from. So I recommend everybody does the same. Now, I want to start today because things are moving so fast, or as Michael would say, 2025 keeps on 2025ing. So maybe a good start would be over the last 6 to 8 weeks, was there anything that truly surprised you? Whether it was what happened with the dollar, whether it was that 12-day war, I guess as it's now known, between Iran and Israel, whether it was the BRICS meeting, which if I recall correctly was not attended by China. So Brent, if I start with you, was there anything you didn't have on your radar for 2025 over the last 6 to 8 weeks?
Well, I would say over the last 5 to 6 weeks, the things that has surprised me is the continuation and the strength of the rally. I was not surprised at the initial volatility we saw in Q1. I wasn't surprised at all that Trump came out very strong on tariffs. I wasn't surprised at all that we had the extremely volatile week in April. And I wasn't surprised by the rally because if you understand how these things work, they never go in a straight line, right? There's going to be starts and stops. And so I expected there to be a rally into kind of the end of May, early June. I did not think that it would continue into the middle of July. So I will be the first to admit that I'm surprised at how long the rally has lasted. But I also think the rally is probably due for an end. And I think we're due for another downturn in risk assets on a global basis.
Michael, any surprises on your radar?
Yes and no. Again, most of it has played out pretty much how I expected. I'll be absolutely honest here. Everything logically told me that we were going to get the US-Iran confrontation that we got, and it was going to go the way that it did, where the US and Israel won, and that shifts the geopolitical, geoeconomic game completely. But they absolutely managed to generate a good enough head fake in terms of pretending that there was a gap between Trump and Netanyahu and that they weren't prepared to go in, that the US was having second thoughts, that they really did catch me out twice, even though I was telling everyone, look, all logic tells me this is going to happen and it's going to happen this weekend. And yet twice in a row, I was completely caught on the hot by it. So yes and no.
So, Brent, in a recent podcast on your YouTube channel, you said something that stuck with me, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on it, but because like clockwork over the last couple of weeks, we heard once again that the end of the dollar is upon us, and de-dollarization is the big thing. And you did a wonderful podcast episode. Again, I ask everyone who's interested in your more detailed analysis to check it out, where you said that de-dollarization, if it should happen, will not happen with a weak dollar, but with a strong dollar. Maybe you can shortly elaborate on this, because this seems to me something that many people are missing.
Sure. And I think this is probably the most difficult thing for people to wrap their heads around it. And I'm the first to admit that it is confusing. And it has to do with de-dollarization, the path, I guess, to de-dollarization. It's not that I don't think that de-dollarization can happen. A lot of people think that I am of the belief that the dollar will be here forever. De-dollarization is impossible, and it's just the way it is. But that's not the case. I do think de-dollarization is possible. I do think it's desired in many cases. But for that to happen, I believe the dollar needs to go higher rather than lower. And the reason is because de-dollarization is the same thing as deleveraging. We live in a world where money is loaned into existence. And it's not just the United States that does this, the entire world economy runs like this. And so if you are going to de-dollarize, that means you have to deleverage that US dollar that's been loaned into existence. And when you deleverage, that typically sees the underlying currency rise while the assets fall, right? And so if we were to get into a situation where we move from our current monetary system onto a new monetary system, I don't see how that happens without the debt being dealt with. And typically the way the debt gets dealt with is either it's paid off or it's defaulted on, one of the two. And if, or it could get inflated away, right? But if it gets inflated away, that's the dollar going lower. In other words, that perpetuates the system. That makes the debts bigger. In other words, for the dollar to go lower, there has to be ample dollar liquidity. The only way that you provide new liquidity into the market is by loaning it into existence. And so while that money gets created via a loan and it provides an initial liquidity surge, a new supply of dollars, and and the dollar falls as a result of that because there's more supply. But what that does simultaneously is it creates medium and long-term demand for when that debt ultimately has to be paid back. And so the seeds of a dollar rise is set when it falls. And if that makes sense. And so that's why, and I know this is kind of a long answer, but I think it'll make sense when I put it into context. In 2020, after COVID, when the central banks of the world came out and did enormous amounts of stimulus, bailouts, QE, however you want to define the extraordinary monetary measures, no one more so than the Fed. Many people said the dollar will never rise again. This is finally it. They're going to print to oblivion and the dollar can only fall. And it did. It fell from 103 to like 89 over the next 12 months. But then after all of that initial surge of liquidity, you started to have to pay those dollars back. And as that medium to long-term demand started to kick in, then you saw the dollar rise. And not only did you see the dollar rise, you saw it go to a 30-year high. And so that's how I think the system ultimately plays out. I think to transition to a new system, we have to de-dollarize. But de-dollarization is when the dollar goes higher and breaks things and causes defaults, not when the dollar goes lower and creates new loans.
Michael, you have written, I think almost now a couple of years back, a piece titled The Age of Rage, where you very nicely, and you referred back to it a couple of times, where you describe how the current economic system, or the so-called liberal world order, of course, also contributed to the hollowing out of the industrial base, and that the right-wing, if you want, populist backlash is part of that story. Now, in your view, connecting it to what Brent just said, do the United States even have an interest in a strong dollar, or wouldn't it potentially serve the interest if the dollar is weaker in order to be more competitive, bring back manufacturing, and all the things that Trump obviously is trying to do?
Well, here's the thing. If you are playing the game as the states, so obviously I'm not American, but I put my hat on and I think, right, how do I play this great game? And that's what I presume we're playing. It's not about markets. It's not about GDP. It's not even about stocks per se. It's just about power and control, using them 100%. As tools. So if that's the game, you can actually make a credible argument that a weaker dollar works. Sure, because suddenly you narrow your trade deficit, you're more competitive, etc., etc. You can make a very compelling argument that a much stronger dollar works because it absolutely crushes other people. That gives you the whip hand to be able to step in and provide liquidity to those who are crying out for it when they need it. You can even create, credit cycles and credit crunches, which allow you to step in. You can make a very credible argument that lower interest rates absolutely help the US because it helps them fund military spending, etc. You can make a very credible argument that very high interest rates help the US because they bleed capital out of the rest of the world into the States. So however they want to play it, they can play it that way. But what I suspect, and I'm segueing slightly, is that rather than just de-dollarization, and I know, Brent, you've been mentioning this over the last couple of days, as I have too, and I, admittedly, as someone who is an incredible skeptic about the entire thing for the longest time, is that I suspect where we're moving quite rapidly now with the tariff issue in the US coming to a head, and I suspect being dealt with fairly soon, and in the US's favor. Following that, we're going to get measures on the capital side, and we are getting, significant discussions about the potential for the emergence of some kind of dollar stablecoin, a new financial system, so a re-dollarization, if you will, where dollar stablecoins, which are digital but backed by US Treasury bills, for example, 1-to-1, suddenly emerge, and the US could turn around and say, right, okay, we're only going to accept payment for international transactions in dollar stablecoins. So everyone internationally would suddenly have to get a dollar stablecoin, which is backed by a treasury bill, which would allow them to then fund their huge fiscal deficit at the short end of the curve, regardless of where interest rates are, by the way. And everyone else would have to start accumulating them to do trade with the US within the system that they're shaping at the moment. So I'll stop now to pass the ball back to you guys. But the clear point is, if you're playing this game the way I think it's being played, you have winning moves on the left and on the right, and just going around the entire field and appearing at the other end. You can go whichever way you want.
Now, I have to ask a question to both of you, and Brent, maybe you want to start. This is going to sound like a weird question, but I mean it absolutely sincerely. Now, when I listen to you and when I read your stuff and also Michael's stuff, I think it's very compelling. Like there is a pattern, there is method to the madness, and I think what we saw play out over the last couple of months or years, that both of you in your estimations and analysis of the situation were more often right than you were wrong. But if we look at this as also, Michael, the term that you coined as grand macro strategy, now, who is doing the strategy? And I mean, this is a sincere question. So when we talk about this idea of a stable coin or the strategy that the US pursues, now, who are the actual flesh and blood players? Is it Scott Bessent? Is it Jerome Powell? Is it Donald Trump? Is it Ludwig? Who are the people who actually then come up and execute these strategies, which I would say take a lot of IQ and brain power, if you will. I mean, these are very, very complex things. So who in your mind, who do you think are the main players who really formulate these ideas and policies?
I would argue it's a combination of a few different people. And I would say that while I am personally not a Trump fan, but it doesn't matter whether I'm a fan or whether I'm not a fan. What matters is what's actually going to happen and what Trump's actually going to do. And I think many people, perhaps rightly so, do not like the way Trump is, and then therefore automatically assume that everything that he says is wrong. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think Trump, for all of his faults, has incredibly good instincts, and I think he understands power. And to Michael's point, and I think he understands debt, probably because he's been in so much of it and has had to deal with the banks for decades. So he kind of understands the game. Let's just call it that. And I agree 100% with what Michael said, is it's not about GDP. It's not about trade. It's not about interest rates. It's about power. This is, in my opinion, this is the big, I always call it the big game. You know, Michael coined it the grand macro strategy. I think we're statecraft. I think we're talking about the same thing. And I think the thing about Trump is such a unique individual. I think to pull off the type of thing that Michael talks about takes a specific type of individual to even attempt, because it will not be popular. Even under the best case scenario, you are going to create incredible amount of enemies. And so it takes a special type of person who can kind of push forward in that despite all the criticism. And I think Trump is the type of guy that can do that. Now, then I think Bessent is a guy who has been involved in markets for 3 or 4 decades, and not only been involved in them, but sat next to the absolute legends in the markets. And even if he wasn't the guy, he sat next to the greatest guys who have ever existed in this business, right? And so I think he has a very good understanding of the capital markets side of trying to enforce America First policies. And then you take a guy like Hegseth. Again, he's kind of a unique individual. He's willing to rough it up with the press. He's willing to be unpopular, and he's willing to kind of do the things that Trump wants him to do. Now, I'm not sitting here and saying that these guys are all-stars. I'm just saying to pull off the type of the grand macro strategy, again, that Michael has written about, it takes a certain combination of people to do it. And I think, for better or for worse, Trump has the team that he wants in place to try to pull this off. And while I don't think it will be pulled off perfectly, and I think there will undoubtedly be unintended consequences that probably come back and hit him in the face a few times, I largely think it will work better than many people think it will work. And I think they will be more successful than the markets tend to think that they will be.
Michael?
Yeah, look, I completely concur. First of all, on the conclusion, I think they will be much more successful, and they have been so far. In terms of who's responsible, a similar point I've made for many years is that Trump, of course, is a businessman originally and in real estate. And you know all about how to sweat assets there. And again, how to deal with banks and how to deal with rather colorful characters, shall we say, in New York City, I'm sure, quite regularly. His instinct as a businessman is a neo-mercantilist. One parallel that I've drawn repeatedly is, in what world would you have the CEO of Burger Company A go to their shareholders meeting and say, well, look, our sales are down 5%. Burger Company B over there, their sales are up 10%. But this is wonderful. This is good for burgers. We applaud the aggregate increase in overall success in burgerdom. That's insane. No CEO could think like that. Every politician listening to every economist is expected to say that, which is ridiculous. So Trump clearly has the instinct of a neo-mercantilist, which is, I want more stuff, and I know how to use money markets to my advantage. Going bankrupt when I have to, changing the game when I have to, sweating assets, etc. To use what I call financial fartcraft as an element of economic statecraft to increase the physical product, which is the building at the end of the day. Now, there are shortfalls, and there's a specific one, which is that while I think they've played a lot of the game right so far, and I mentioned the action in Iran recently, the last 24 hours, I'm sure you've seen the same headlines. You had a leaked tape of Trump saying that he said he was going to bomb Moscow and Beijing, if they crossed red lines. And now, it's only him saying it. He didn't necessarily mean it, but he said, I wanted to put a 10% element of doubt in their mind, maybe 5%. That's enough to reinstall deterrence. That I've got to think twice before I do something. He's not wrong, even if it's a very risky game. But hey, life is risky. But where they're falling short is, yes, they've done that. But if you see the press this morning, and, frankly, I couldn't have given you the precise number, but I knew this was true. The US only has 25% of the Patriot missile stock that it needs. And that's before you get another mess in the Middle East, before you start wanting to give them to Ukraine, etc., or anyone else who's going to need them soon, which will be others. So there is still a shortage of physical stuff. So the neo-mercantilism hasn't worked yet because it takes years to get those supply chains working. And China, of course, controls rare earths, without which you can't produce these things. They have a complete chokehold over them because China plays this game even better than anyone else up until now. So there are going to have to be messy compromises. There are going to have to be deals struck, in smoke-filled rooms. And both economists and free traders, and even neocons who like things being done a certain way, and maybe even MAGA types are all going to be pulling their hair out at different times, saying this isn't consistent with what I thought we were going to get. But it's all going to be necessary to get to where you want to go, starting from where we are, which is somewhere that nobody would want to be.
I mean, this opens
could
up.
Could I
go on, Brent? Yes,
just
absolutely.
one thing on the end of that, because again, I think people probably know this. Michael and I see things so similarly that in some cases, like, he finishes my thoughts for me when he's saying things. I feel like he's like cracked open my head and said in a more eloquent way the things that I'm thinking about. But I think one of the reasons that people struggle with analyzing what Trump and Bassett and Hesketh and all these, all these people are up to, is because they are looking at it through a Keynesian lens of the last 100 years, where for the most part, we had free market dynamics, both in play and taught in schools and implemented by various monetary authorities. Now, obviously, we don't have a free market. Central banks still exist, and we've got regulation. So it's not the wild, wild west. But by and large, the last 100 years have been characterized by more free market dynamics than basically at any time in history. And so when you analyze the things that Trump is trying to do now through that lens, it looks like it cannot possibly work. But if you go back for the other 5,000 or 4,990 years of history, other than the last 100 years, it did work. And it was possible. Now, perhaps it didn't work as efficiently. Perhaps it wasn't as nice a world. Perhaps there was more conflict as a result of it, but it did work. And I think that's what people struggle with. I think they feel like because we are an evolved species, we must always move forward and become more enlightened and more sophisticated rather than have periods of less enlightenment and less sophistication. And I jokingly, a year ago, somebody asked me, what's a technology you think that people don't consider right now, but that may be very important in the years ahead? And my answer was sticks and stones. Now, I said that jokingly, right? But there's a little bit of truth to it. And that I mean is that things don't always go forward in a straight line. You have times where you go forward, and then you have periods where you pull back and go forward, and period pull back. And I think we're in a transition period where the future is perhaps incredibly bright, but I think we're in for a somewhat dark transition period before that happens. I would love to be wrong on this. I would happily be wrong. I have a pretty good life with the way the world is right now. So from a personal perspective, this is not something that I'm hoping happens. But my job is not to hope about how the world I would like to be. My job is to figure out how it actually is. And that's just kind of what I see happening in the next few years.
So, but that opens up a question. So, if we take everything we just discussed for granted, as I could, there is a shift in strategy. I think it would also be fair to say that, in a sense, the West, or the United States particularly, are returning to a game. They're returning to a table where the other players have been sitting around for a while. I think it's fair to say that the Chinese have been pursuing a grand strategy for quite a while, at least when it came to the setup of their economy. You could say it's partially true also for the Russians. Now, the question then remains is there enough time? I mean, as you just said, Brent, right? We're talking of a transition period of quite historical changes, but 4 years, and after 2 years, next year, there are midterm elections. And this is a very painful question, is the system, not just in the United States, all over the so-called mature democracies, are these systems even capable of formulating necessary or needed long-term strategies if you always have to fear or expect that some other guy, some other person is coming into office and they will reverse that course correction or stop that course correction? As things, for example, gear up now, I'm speculating here, we can go back to this in 3 years, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 2028 we see Alessandro Ocasio-Cortez of the Democrats run against J.D. Vance. But if then we look back and say, okay, from a macro strategy, a lot that happened during the Trump administration was correct, but in order to reap the rewards, that's still going to take a couple of years. That's probably not going to matter for the American voter. So they potentially then vote a politically, ideologically, completely different administration into office than the one that was in charge between 2024 and 2028.
So I'll take a quick stab at it, and then I'll hand over to Michael. So I would say, from my perspective, I think, again, Trump is the type of an individual that could perhaps, I don't know, flourish, for lack of a better word, in this type of an environment. But having said that, I kind of think the same thing would be happening regardless of who was president. Perhaps it wouldn't be happening in the same way. Perhaps we wouldn't be characterized by the same rhetoric. Perhaps it wouldn't be as inflammatory. But I think it would largely be happening anyway. And I think part of the reason is because the whole world has kind of gotten itself into this mess with all of these bad debts. Everybody's kind of in the same position. Everybody's kind of dealing with the same problems. And when you deal with domestic problems, one of the best way to deflect them is to blame the evil foreigner. Now, that's a pretty simplistic way to explain this, but I think it holds. And I think as economic growth, or however you want to define that, slows down, it puts pressure on other things, whether they're social, geopolitical, domestic political, and I think that then causes. So I think this grand conflict, or this big game, this game of, I have called it a Game of Thrones. I think this is going to happen regardless of who is president. And perhaps whoever's in the White House or whoever's in the administration, if it's a consistent administration, maybe it plays out over 8 to 10 years. And if it's not a consistent administration, maybe it plays out over 15 or 20 years. I think it probably plays out over a longer time period than many people think. But I think it plays out regardless of who's in power.
But if you allow me to play devil's advocate, and Michael, hand it to you. So a couple of minutes ago, we were saying that actually the personality of Trump and Pete Hegseth, that it plays a significant role. And now we slightly, and I'm deliberately provocative now, and now we slightly shifted to say, well, technically or most likely these changes will happen anyways, regardless of who's in charge. So does it matter who's in charge, or doesn't it matter who's in charge?
Okay, so it matters. Because, as Brent said, I completely agree, these underlying forces are not going to go away. They pointed to the emergence of someone like Trump as someone who's now president rather than just being Trump in a different sphere. Many, many years ago, I remember having email conversations with an in-law back in, I think, around 2008, 2009, saying at some point the Americans will elect a president who puts a 40% tariff on China. And he'd utterly dismissed me and said that's never going to happen. Well, there you go. And I can dig out the email to prove it if I have to. But the point being, these pressures won't go away. If you play the game well, you do well. If you play the game badly, you do badly. But I try and break it down like this within the context we've all just agreed, I think. If you look at each of the particular binary decisions that are like a selling point within an election. Now, I know all politics is local. I know, one particular bad speech or meme can really do a lot of damage. I'm not naive. But if you take it as a more logical binary, what's Trump's position vis-a-vis the military? Just as a start, okay? Peace through strength. Now, of course, that's a high-risk strategy where you have to do things occasionally, like bombing Iran, which could have gone horribly wrong, but appears to have gone very well. What's the opposite? If you're going to oppose that, and I'm not trying to be party political, I'm trying to cut across logical lines. Well, peace through strength or war through weakness? Which one's going to sell better? So Trump's offering tax cuts. Are tax hikes going to be popular? No. So everyone's going to want tax cuts. The Democrats are probably going to offer more social spending, or the Trump's cuts actually are probably going to be rolled back. So we're going to get more spending and tax cuts at the same time. So we know what a fiscal mess that is implied in that. Let's look at the border. Do you want an open border or do you want a closed border? Well, most people are going to say a closed border. Do you want higher wages or lower wages? Well, most people are going to say higher wages. You go through the binary like that. And at the end of the day, and this is what I was arguing in the Age of Rage, you end up with a set of policy choices which point to a very, very difficult to achieve outcome, which is, really, really a dream scenario, you can't get all of it. You can get quite a lot of it if you play this great game, if you adopt grand macro strategy. But to add one more analogy to it, when I hear politics in the UK, where I'm from, in the States most of the time, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Europe, all the countries where I have clients and friends or family, and I get involved in a discussion, even though all politics is local, I find it depressingly two-dimensional. I see, the great and the good in each of these countries waffling on, and I literally see it in a 2D plane. They're saying, okay, so we think the state should be taxing a bit more. We think the state should be cutting taxes a bit. We want a bit more regulation here. We want a bit less regulation there, etc., etc. You understand what I'm saying? The left wing, right wing traditional argument. And I say to all of them, they need to think three-dimensionally to go up to the apex here, which is, how do I do that in a mercantilist world where China has complete chokehold over rare earths, for example, or where other countries are running an aggressive industrial strategy to the point where we can't rely on this input, or we can't export to them, or they are piece by piece going to remove our industrial base here, here, and here. If you go up to that apex, regardless of whether you play the game well or you play the game badly, and that does matter, you are forced to play that game. And if you don't, if you stick to two-dimensional politics, sure, you could win an election. It absolutely could happen. But the outcome will be catastrophic, either quickly or slowly. And whoever comes next will have to double down and go back to that third dimension, which I still think, whether you like it or not, and again, like Brent, I'm not saying I do like it, I just see the logic of it. The more I game it in my head, it still ends up with a neo-mercantilist, what you would call national conservative, or currently more Trumpian policy package, because there's no other way to tick all those boxes that everybody else wants ticked. You can't, for example, say we're going to cut taxes and have social spending and have an open border and disarm. Well, I guess you can to a certain degree. You could say, right, fine, well, if we disarm, everyone will just invest in us, etc., and everyone will come in, and somehow we can afford to fund a welfare state for a large new population. That's not just in the US, that's in Europe, that's in everywhere. But I don't know how sustainable that model is in the longer run if you start saying, what if this, what if that, what if this, etc., etc., to say nothing of the backlash from maybe 40% of the population in each country, which, is a voting bloc which can reject things even if they can't impose power or gain power. So I don't want to talk too long on that. But the point being, yes, the elections matter, but the underlying fundamentals just don't change here. And I think inexorably we continue to grind in one direction.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I fully agree with both of you. But there sometimes seems to be, let's call it, resistance on part of political decision makers to accept these structural forces that are simply there. I mean, the best example, you mentioned it in passing, I think, is Europe, and there particularly Germany. Right? I mean, you can have politicians, you can have a political class that is, for lack of a better term, at odds with reality. Whether, I always think the Europeans are in some areas a very good example of this. And you're right, at some point there will be things move back towards the mean, or reality will always reassert itself. But I guess there can be a lot of pain. That's number one before that happens. And secondly, I guess the competitors or the competition is not sleeping either. So is there, to put it as a provocative question, is there a chance that if we say it is this great game, if you want, that the West / the United States, whatever you want to determine, that they're actually losing that game, right? That really it feels sometimes on social media, some people wish and hope for it. I personally don't. I think that the U.S. leadership overall has been a good thing, but again, that's a different topic. But that in fact the other players at the board are better. It's a famous saying: you don't have to be the best chess player in the world to win the game. You just have to be better than your opponents. And what if, due to elections, whatever it is, the opponents, again, I don't think that Chinese are necessarily geniuses, but what if they simply turn out to be better than we are?
Well, this is what I'll say with that. The first thing is that I don't know what's going to happen. Now, there's a lot of people who are absolutely sure they know exactly what's going to happen. I'm not one of them. I have a high degree of confidence what's going to happen, but I don't know. So, of course, there can be unforeseen circumstances that come into play. And the second thing I'll say is I don't expect the U.S. to come out of this smelling like roses necessarily. The analogy I have used is, I'm a kid of the 80s, and I love, 80s music and 80s movies and 80s sports. And there was a very big boxing match, one of the greatest boxing matches that ever took place, between Thomas Hearns and Marvin Hagler in like 1983. And in the very first round, Thomas Hearns hit Marvin Hagler so hard that he had a huge cut over his eye. They almost had to stop the fight. Somehow, Marvin Hagler's corner got the blood stopped. It went into the third round, and Marvin Hagler knocked out Hearns in the third round. So despite the cut over his eye, he ended up winning the fight. And the reason I like that analogy is I think we're going into a fight. Now, perhaps it'll just be an economic fight. Hopefully there's not a military fight, but I think there's going to be a conflict nonetheless. I fully expect the United States to get hit. We'll probably bleed a little bit. I just happen to think the U.S. has the ability to throw knockout blows that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily have. And so do I have to potentially plan for the U.S. losing? Of course, that's always possible. But I think it's unlikely. The framework that I use, and again, I'm a money manager, so I'm always like thinking of this from where do I allocate capital and how do I minimize risk? And I see four possible scenarios in the years ahead. Perhaps where this is all ado about nothing. It's all going to calm down, and the whole world is going to grow out of this. We're going to discover some technology, and the whole world's going to grow out of this mess, and everything's going to be fine, in which case the whole world rises together. That's one possibility. The other possibility is I'm right that this is a big conflict. It's a big disaster, and we're all going to go down together. Okay. The third option is that somehow the U.S. hangs on and does okay, and the rest of the world falls. And then the fourth option is that the U.S. falls and the rest of the world rises. Now, out of three of those four scenarios, I would rather be invested in the United States than abroad, because in the first three, even if I don't make as much as somebody else where I'm still doing okay. It's only in the fourth scenario, where the U.S. falls and the rest of the world rises, that I would rather be invested somewhere else. And so I have to account for that possibility. But when I look at history and I look at how markets are intertwined, and I look at the advantages that the United States has versus the rest of the world, that's a pretty small probability, especially when you consider how intertwined the rest of the world's economies are with the U.S. consumer. So it's really hard for me to see how the U.S. goes into a massive recession or has some kind of a big downturn, and the rest of the world thrives as a result of that. So it's not that I think that it's impossible, and I always have to consider that it is possible. I think it's a fairly low probability, and so I'm not going to bet on that small probability.
But if I stick, because I really like the boxing match analogy, but if I can add on something to it, at least in this example, I think both boxers accept the fact that a boxing match is actually taking place. I sometimes, at least in this, high and mighty academic circles that I sometimes travel in, there the answer would be, well, your boxing match is just a social construct, right? It doesn't really exist. So why does there have to be any conflict at all? And then what you see happen, I mean, you saw this also over the last couple of years, and you see it also, I think, a lot in quasi-political influences, which is, what has Iran ever done to us? What have the Chinese ever done to us? So any conflict is just a reaction to the United States, and the only countries that have agency are the United States. And sometimes I guess they would also claim Israel, and everybody else is just reacting to it. But in order to be prepared for that competition, to give two concrete examples, we now have these tariffs on copper by the Trump administration. But I think currently there are, if I got the numbers right, there are 3 active copper smelters in the United States. 50% of all copper smelting capacity is in China, right? When it comes to crude oil refining, the Chinese have long surpassed the United States. When it comes to electricity production, the Chinese have surpassed the United States. And something, Michael, that you talked about quite a bit in the past, shipbuilding capacity, the Chinese have surpassed the United States. It is, going back to Michael's point, the question, what is GDP for, and who can actually make stuff? But also, for how long can you do it? So my fear is, if you look at conflicts in the past, or my estimate is that, as you said, right, Brent, that the United States might get bloody, but I have a sense that once they get bloody, even though they probably would still have it in them to get out victorious, it seems to me sometimes they just lose interest. And then instead of keeping fighting on, so to speak, they just say, oh my God, this is just not worth it, which is a little bit, I would say, what we saw in Afghanistan, what we saw in Iraq, and even what we see now gradual with the conflict in Gaza and the Middle East, where I think a lot of this shift that is becoming more critical towards Israel is not because everybody's all of a sudden turning into an anti-Semite. It's more the attention deficit in the United States that they say, they look at their watches and say, okay, October 7th, that was almost 3 years ago. Can't this thing be over? What would you say to that argument, Michael?
Well, okay, there's a lot to unpack there. let me try and remember as many elements of it as I can.
I have to keep you slightly longer, I'm afraid.
No problem. Okay, first of all, in terms of the academia side, there's a word for academics and politicians and business people and media individuals, etc., who had those views. In fact, there are several words for them. I won't use them. Most of them are not very flattering. Irrelevant would perhaps be the most neutral that I can use, and wrong. So let's just start with that. Let's then jump to the last point before I come back to the meat in your sandwich, which is, will the US just walk away? Well, you could argue that's actually what happened under Obama more than anything. Obama was definitely attempting to just disengage from the world and just say America is not exceptional. We're just going to basically start doing our own thing more and more and focus inwards, on social conflicts rather than this grand geopolitical stuff. And Trump obviously is a US exceptionalist through and through, for better or worse. There is absolutely very, very clear historical precedent, again and again, in many key areas, where the US wins the boxing match with a tooth knocked out, but has just destroyed the other opponent, pulverized them, and then decides, I'm going to give up boxing and go home and drink a 6-pack every single day and smoke a couple of packs of cigarettes and just watch cable TV. I mean, for example, here's a really good one linked to the shipbuilding one, and I will come back to the industrial side. So this is a segue to that. Post-World War II, the US obviously had the world's largest merchant marine because it had to build it during war in order to make sure they could get everything around logistically. The actual design of most of the ships they were building were not very good. They had designed a very good one, and they actually ended up using a very, very crappy British design instead for silly bureaucratic reasons. So they had some good merchant marine ships, and all of them which were not very good. The Liberty ones were not considered very good. What did they do when they had the world's largest merchant marine? Did they set up a private entity with government supervision or a government supervised company to say, we now control global logistics everywhere going forward? Because they would have if they'd wanted to. No, Congress said, this is communism. We have to get rid of it immediately. So what did they do? They offered, just like cents on the dollar, an auction to all of their allies in Europe and Japan, etc., in Asia as they were rebuilding, and said, you can have as many of these ships as you want for basically like a couple of cents on a dollar, because we don't want them because otherwise it's communism. And of course, they bought all the good ones. And they left America with all the worst ones, which couldn't compete when they actually started to then try and run it as a commercial company later. So the history is replete of America making those mistakes after they've won. But how could they win this? Well, I think there is recognition now. China outproduces America multiples on every single front that matters, whether it's smelting, whether it's rare earths, where they have a monopoly, which is crucial, whether it's any particular product, you name it. That is the critical issue. What you are seeing from grand macro strategy under Trump is an attempt to shake up everything, no matter how much it offends different interest groups, to say, we need to produce more of X, Y, or Z, because otherwise in the future, there isn't going to be an American economy. There isn't going to be an America the way we understand it. This discussion will be moot. Like, what's the point in talking about this if we don't produce anything other than stupid academics who say that conflict is a social construct, in which I'd say, give them a kick up the bum and take their lunch money and see what they say. But I've had it done to me. But they need to produce more. But they are going to have to do that together. So shipbuilding, just as one example, who currently can rival shipbuilding to China? Only Japan and South Korea. Who hasn't done a trade deal with the US yet? Japan and South Korea. Who ultimately, and I've argued this since day one, is going to be melded into the US national security economy so that US ships are built in Japan or in South Korea until US shipyards get back on stream, which will be a couple of years down the line minimum, Japan and South Korea, which is going to have to involve an extension of the dollar network over them rather than it all being done purely in yen, etc., etc. And other countries will have to come on board. And even in Europe, I can assure you of this, after many discussions with different stakeholders, I don't want to say what ratio, okay, because it varies country by country. An awful lot of people in Europe are, frankly, in the conflict is a social construct silly camp, all right? And again, I want to come up with a great acronym for them or a nickname, but the silly people, let's say. There are also people who are aware of how the world really works and doing everything they can underneath the headlines to deepen relations with the US. For example, Rheinmetall, the big German arms company, so many European politicians and journalists are saying, well, there you go. That's going to be the champion of European strategic autonomy, building our defense network for the future. They're deepening relations with US companies. They're absolutely integrating with them more and more closely. So underneath the headlines, I think we can see the reality that is happening. And that combined block, I think, is a touch wood, can stand up to China. And only that combined block.
Can I just build on something Michael said here, because I think we have each talked about this before, but if there's somebody new listening and hasn't heard this aspect, and I don't want to speak for Michael, but I think he agrees with me, is the point that you bring up, Ralph. This is the point of the tariffs, in my opinion. The tariffs are not about trade. I mean, they're related to trade and they obviously influence trade, but they are about making America ready for a conflict such as we're discussing, should it come. They are about making the homeland self-sufficient, or at least quasi-self-sufficient, with friendly neighbors and allies, as opposed to, needing critical minerals or supplies from a rival. And the tariffs are just the stick with which Trump is encouraging people, for lack of a better way of saying it, to help the U.S. become self-sufficient in these areas. And I think it's, to me, in many ways, it's like in 300 or 400 years ago when there was a king and he was getting ready to go to war with a rival, and he would call his bannermen, right? And he would call all the lords and he'd say, "Are you with me or are you against me? And if you're not with me, then I'm going to war with you first." But the first thing is he shores up his own tribe at home, right? And he figures out who's on his side, who's not, who can help me, who cannot help me. And once he's consolidated power or confirmed his call, then they go fight the big rival. And I feel like that's in many ways what the tariffs are being used to do. Trump is in many ways repeating what Bush said after 9/11. You're either with us or against us. Now, I didn't really like it when Bush said it, and I don't really like it when Trump's saying it. But again, it's not my job to figure out what I like and what I don't like. My job is to figure out what's going to happen based on the people in power, what they're doing. And I think that's what they're doing. And again, I think they will be more successful at it than the people who don't think it will be successful just because they don't, quote unquote, like it.
So would you then say, which almost would have a certain irony to it, that the current US administration is more focused, even if it doesn't appear like it on the first glance, is more focused on foreign policy than it is on domestic policy? Or is that the ultimate driving force behind everything that's happening, the focus on reviving domestic industry? So if you would have to say, is it grand macro strategy on a global stage, or is grand macro strategy kind of just a secondary effect as from the desire to bring back manufacturing and industry to the United States?
Well, let me define it like this. Sorry, Brent, just to jump in there. One of the key points I've been making is that economic statecraft, which is the technical term for it, is replacing economic policy. And I think we're in agreement on that. So economic statecraft is alongside military statecraft and political statecraft. Those are the three legs. You put them together, and that's what I call the grand macro strategy, to try and understand how that impacts on markets. That's my shtick, right? But the actual statecraft component is a standard terminology. But if you read any dictionary definition of economic statecraft, they are saying that you use the economy for foreign policy or national security goals. If not, it is economic policy. So that's the whole point. Domestic policy and foreign policy are fused conceptually. You can't have one without the other. And again, that's what's confusing people. They can't get their head around that because they think they're two different things, and they're not.
But that's the thing.
I would almost say, I'm sorry to jump in, Ralph. I would almost say that foreign policy is necessary. The grand macro strategy foreign policy is necessary to, quote unquote, make America great again, or make America first, or that's how I would explain it. So it's not that Trump necessarily wants to be focused on foreign policy. It's that it's necessary to focus on foreign policy to accomplish what he wants at home.
I mean, I know we have to come to a conclusion, but if I just can keep a little longer, because this is such a riveting conversation, even though it's so, like, for some of you early, for some of you late, and for some of us in the middle of the night. But Michael, you mentioned that one of the things you do in your approach, right? You look a lot into history. You look a lot into also economists that everybody's quoting, but nobody's actually reading anymore, like David Ricardo, like Adam Smith. And what I'm wondering sometimes is it possible that there is just this divergence in minds, or in mindset, if you want, exactly as you just described? There is this idea that I still believe in, and I think that was completely natural to people, as you also mentioned, Brent, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, I would say probably even 80 years ago, right? That the role of a nation, or that a key element of the self-understanding of a nation is in its relation to the world, right? As you say, that part of the economy is to get a nation ready, or to avoid conflict with others, so to be impressive enough, to be determined enough to avoid conflict. But this is a mindset, I'm not sure if this is still, at least in the West, prevalent enough. Exactly what you guys mentioned, that there's this sense that you can, and which so many, I think, expected from Trump, that making America great again means retreating from the world. Although I think what you gentlemen say is much more correct, that in fact, making America great, however you want to then define the great term, but that is tightly connected to foreign policy. But it seems to me that many in the commentariat, or left, right, and center, they think that greatness comes from retreating from the world. And I'm not sure if the mindset is there to really then execute on the long term, on the medium to long term, the grand macro strategy or economic statecraft per se, because you will always have people that say, well, is it really necessary? And can't we just do our things? Who needs the rest of the world?
Well, I think there are a couple of different ways to look at that very briefly. The first one is that isolationism, and that Brent, you're the American in the team here, is absolutely dyed in the wool as an American tradition, and for very, very good reason. But every single time the Americans have tried to go that route, they always find out they get sucked back in again. I'm not going to do the movie impression from that line. They always think they're out and they're always sucked back in. So I don't think that dynamic will ever go away. And I think, to square the circle there, Trump is attempting to try and retreat and step forward at the same time to form a new defensible perimeter, which is what America always does. Now, traditionally, it does it after large conflicts globally, from an idealist perspective. So here's a lot of acronyms and international committees and, a global vision, if you will, which keeps us safe and secure and prosperous. There we go. He's trying to do it from a realist perspective, which is, I don't trust you, and I don't trust you, and I know that doesn't work. I'm not about acronyms. But this will keep us safe and secure. But it still has to be, inwards looking out, outwards looking in at the same time. But I think a larger conceptual overlay, not just about Trump, that you were also referring to, is now within every Western country, and to be honest, even within emerging markets too, although to a different degree and depending on the geography, between those who absolutely still think the long run of human history is about how your country sits vis-a-vis others and its security, its prosperity, etc., and people who think the countries don't exist. And borders don't exist, and see everything as a total system, which is interesting because they always tend to live in the most prosperous parts of that system rather than the worst off parts, and they very rarely volunteer to go and live in the poor parts without infrastructure and social services, etc. So it's extremely convenient how they see it, but that is absolutely a dichotomy, and I don't think that will go away. And that's what you see playing out in election after election. But I mean, to refer back to an earlier point I made very briefly, I don't think they're a majority. I think they may be the majority in many institutional structures, which are legacy, and they can be an obstruction to the other part. But I think the other faction actually has a democratic majority, or an emerging democratic majority, in many Western countries now. And that tension is something we see playing out around us over and over and over again. And it's something that also creates huge volatility in markets we have to watch for. Mr. X is elected or Mrs. X is elected and suddenly can't do anything. Or he's hobbled.
Yeah. There's another aspect. We haven't really talked about it tonight, and we probably don't have time to talk about it other than a few your comments here. But the one thing we haven't really talked about is part of the reason the U.S. has not, I guess, retreated into its domestic confines. And part of the reason that even if it did that, it gets, quote unquote, sucked back in to the conflict is because the U.S. dollar is inextricably linked to every other economy in the world. It is virtually impossible to totally separate the U.S. economy from the rest of the world without an incredible amount of volatility. And this goes back to the de-dollarization comment we talked about at the beginning. The rest of the world, whether they like it or not, and they don't like it, they run on the US dollar. The US dollar is the liquidity and the string on which the entire world operates. And part of the reason the US has been able to maintain its hegemony despite the deficits, despite the bailouts, despite the bad policies, despite the amount of QE that we've done, is because there is an incredible amount of demand outside the US borders for its currency. If any other country even attempted to do a third of the financial profligate policies that the United States runs, they go into crisis mode almost immediately. The markets punish them almost immediately. And while the markets will throw a fit and perhaps throw a tantrum when the U.S. does it, for the most part, the U.S. has been able to get away with it. And it's because the rest of the world needs our liability. So in other words, the liabilities of the United States are the liquidity that the rest of the world needs. And if the U.S. were to pull back and were to not provide that liquidity, I can almost guarantee you the rest of the world would declare war on the United States as a result, because they would consider it an economic act of war on them. And so this is where it gets really, really, I mean, this is the big game. It is so big, it is so complex, and there are so many different avenues that this goes down that even if the U.S. wanted to just kind of be the nice guy and pull back and not get involved anywhere, it's virtually impossible for that to happen. It's probably bad to throw that on you right here, as I know we're getting towards the end of the conversation. But that, to me, that's really what this is all about. It's all about the rest of the world built their own prison by developing the euro dollar market. And at the time, they did it because it helped them, and they didn't realize what they were doing. And now they're stuck.
It's a little bit like trying to separate Siamese twins in a sense, right?
That's exactly what it is. I mean, that's a perfect example. Like, how do you do it? It's hard to save one without killing the other. You're right. And ultimately, maybe they both die. but the point is even under the best case scenario, this is going to be an extremely volatile and unsmooth, for lack of a better word, process. And it's why it's why the world can't just easily de-dollarize, and it's why the U.S. can't just easily retreat, because we are so intertwined.
And maybe as a concluding question to both of you, because one thing seems to be clear that truly are tremendous changes on the way. There's one apocryphal Lenin quote, I think, Michael, that you used in a number of occasions. The famous saying that there are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen, and it really sometimes feels like it. So, just as for both of us, a concluding remark, why do you think it might be sound like a stupid question, but why is it happening now? So things kind of moved on, they grinded along, and there is a sense, I think, everywhere, left, right, and center, among the chattering classes. But I think there's the one agreement that is there is that things are changing. Some are more optimistic, some are more pessimistic, some greets the whatever the new world order is going to be, some fear of it, but everybody agrees that something is happening. Why now? What changed in the last, let's say, 5 years, or whichever time frame you want to use, that things are moving so quickly and sometimes so they're overwhelmingly? As you mean, Michael always does a great rundown every day of what's happening in the world of economics and geopolitics, and it's really there has not been a single dull day in 2025. So why is that? It's very weird.
Well, I can't match Lenin's wit, unfortunately, because like him or hate him, he was very witty. But I would say, in crude but realistic terms, it's all happening now because it didn't happen up until now. That we have built a structure, or we had built a structure, presuming incredibly arrogantly, incredibly stupidly, incredibly ahistorically, that nothing would ever happen, and that this idealist integrated framework, which was in its simplest form, be whoever you want to be and do whatever you want to do, effectively, both in cultural terms and in economic terms, could only produce good outcomes. Hey, look, it's very seductive. Who doesn't like to hear that? And a lot of people made a lot of money from doing that for a very long time. But the long run of history shows that no system is ever permanently stable, particularly one that doesn't think about itself and how other things may change, that never really fully understood all the players that have been integrated into that system and which did not think and did not act the same way at all at core. And then you throw on top, technological changes, which are always going to happen either randomly or in cycles or waves, depending on whatever viewpoint you have of that, and the compounding and conflating effects of the cumulative damage and differences created by that system. As I said, centrist policies create centrifugal forces which destroy centrism. That's just absolutely baked into the cake. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Some countries become large net exporters, other countries become large net importers. National security becomes threatened bit by bit. Everything collapses because of being sensible and centrist. The system contained the roots of its own demise. It was always going to happen, and once it started to happen, it couldn't stop happening.
I would just build on what Michael says, and to me, it's as simple as the systemic result of a debt-based monetary system. And what I mean by that is, without getting too technical, the design of our monetary system is one in where money gets loaned into existence. And as a result, the system has to grow because there's never enough money to pay off all the debt. In a system where money is loaned into existence and there's a positive interest rate, there's never enough money to pay off all the debt. So the system has to continually grow. Any system that continually grows year after year, decade after decade, will eventually turn up like an exponential curve, and then it goes up faster and faster and faster. And I think after 100 years, or whatever the number is, of this debt-based monetary system, we have reached the point where the curve has turned up. And it hasn't gone exponential yet, but it's heading in that direction. And once that happens, it's just a matter of time before things start to break. And I think that then plays into all kinds of other things, whether it's social, whether it's political, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's economic. And that's I just think that's where we're at right now. And you know, it's going to be a hell of a few years.
This leaves me with my
Lenin would have agreed, by the way. Lenin would have agreed completely on that, on the monetary side. Sorry.
This leaves me with and I promise it's my very, very last question, but I think it's a wonderful way to end our conversation. So are we experiencing the return of the primacy of politics? So it's no longer, Michael, as you said, because markets, or that it's about the free exchange, or as Michael said, be whatever we want to be, that we are re-entering a period where everything that happens, and I think this will bleed over from the realm of economics, also in the realm of the cultural and the social, to say, what is in the national interest? What's in the state's interest? What does this mean for foreign policy? What does this mean for the power of the state? That the quote-unquote libertarian area, also domestically, when we say free market was internationally, and domestically there was a sense of libertarianism, that this is going to end, that politics will completely reassert itself, and this idea that everything needs to be tested or looked at, and what does it mean for national security? For example, can you allow ideas that you see this now, for example, with the potential new mayoral candidate in New York, right? Where I say, okay, this person has views that can be perceived as being a threat to national security, that are anti-American. So it's not just about, people have the right to vote for whomever they want. They have the right to vote for whomever they want, unless it threatens, let's say, the sovereignty or the ability of national unity, whatever then you want to name it. But in a nutshell, do you think it's really the return of a primacy of politics over many, many other things?
Yes. In terms of the New York election specifically, when people say to me when I go around the world, don't you think Trump is going to be rejected at some point by the electorate? I say, look at New York. That's your alternative. It's not. We're not going back to the center. With great distaste in even mentioning the name, Carl Schmitt said, "Sovereign is he who decides the exception," as you know. And my own, again, very crude version of that is markets and everyone are going to rapidly learn where real power sits, and the answer is on you if you're not careful.
Yeah, and I think the way I would say it is, globally things are going to decentralize. In other words, for years and years we were moving towards globalization, one central market, one supply chain, one globally integrated economy. And now it's going the other way. Rather than being centralized, it's being decentralized on a global basis. But domestically, in basically every country around the world, I think power is going to become more centralized. So I think we're going to see decentralized integration on a global scale, but I think we're going to see more centralization on domestic scales. Now, again, that's not something that I particularly like, but that's where I think it's headed. And I think the pendulum swings so far in one direction that now it's swinging back the other direction, and I think it has a while to go before it stops.
Well, to quote a very wise man named Brent Johnson, we are not here to advocate for something. We're here to acknowledge. So we're analysts and not advocates. And I think that also came through very well in this conversation. Full disclosure to our viewers, I originally announced that this is going to be a 40-minute conversation. It now turned almost twice as long. So my deepest gratitude to Brent and Michael for allowing me to keep them much, much longer than I originally intended. This was a fantastic conversation, and I can really say I hope that I can have both of you on again. I mean, this is, I think, precisely the kind of conversations and analysis that we need at the moment. It's a fascinating period we're living through. Thank you so much for coming on. We will put links, of course, to Brent's Substack and his X account into the description. The same with Michael. We'll link to his work at Rabobank, which is, by the way, something I highly recommend. It's sometimes, because it's Rabobank, people might be afraid that it's very technical, but there's a lot of history in it. There's a lot of very interesting analogies in it. So it's thinking beyond pure numbers. As Michael used to say, it's not just numbers on a screen. It's also or lines on a screen. It's also lines on the maps that matter more and more. So we'll link to all of it. Check out the work. It's great. It's fantastic. Brent also has a wonderful YouTube channel. A lot of that stuff is available for free. Although I do also recommend, sometimes paywalls are absolutely justified, and it's definitely worth your money and your time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.